A new study finds prescription statin drugs are effective in lowering the risk of cardiovascular disease and death, especially in older adults.
We're back now with news about the blockbuster cholesterol drugs called statins. Doctors say they work wonders to prevent heart disease, but many patients say the side effects are just too painful.
If you take a statin for 5 years, having had a heart attack, how much would you think or hope it would add to your life expectancy?
30%?
Yeah. Okay. So a few years. I'll add a few years extra. Yeah? You want the answer?
Yes.
Just over 4 days.
Have you ever wondered if there was a supplement stack that could lower your cholesterol levels without having to use a statin? With heart disease as the #1 killer in the US, we all have a healthy fear of having a heart attack. However, more and more, the side effects of the very medications that are supposed to protect our heart, known as statins, are becoming much more well known. Side effects like mitochondrial dysfunction, myopathy, cognitive dysfunction, diabetes, etc. So when your blood test comes back with some of the markers not looking so good, and you're offered a statin as a solution to protect your heart over the long term, the choice isn't always so clear-cut. It's not such an easy one to make. That is why I created a pro-metabolic cholesterol-lowering supplement stack that I've used in conjunction with diet and lifestyle changes to help hundreds of my clients lower their cholesterol levels from tens to hundreds of points without the use of a statin. Now, before we jump in, if you would like to set up your own pro-metabolic diet so that you can consistently lose body fat without crashing your metabolism or driving up your stress hormones, I created a free guide for you to construct a diet specific to your goals. I'll put the link in the description. So in this video, I'm going to show you first, the blood tests that I look at to understand cardiovascular risk. Second, the supplements that I like to use to shift these markers. And third, the dosages that I like to use for these specific supplements, as well as some of the brands. But before that, so that you fully understand why these blood tests are the key blood tests to get to look at your cardiovascular risk, I'm going to quickly break down cardiovascular disease and cholesterol for you in a nutshell. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that fats and water, or oil and water, don't mix. And that same principle occurs inside the human body. So when you have fats or lipids, they need to be carried through our bloodstream, which is water-based, in order for things to work appropriately. And that's where lipoproteins come in. So the lipoproteins' job, HDL, LDL, so there's actually proteins on these particles. These are called the lipoproteins. They allow the fats that we eat to be encapsulated in this protein structure that also incorporates some other components of phospholipids so that they can move through the blood appropriately without getting that separation effect that you see if you were to put oil in water. Now, the major ones that we tend to look at are LDL and HDL. Now, there's different types of these, and we'll talk about those in a second. But the general idea to understand here first is that the LDL and the HDL are basically carriers of these fats. And in general, the LDL's job is to take cholesterol or lipids, fats, from the liver and transport them to the tissues, to the muscles, to the fat cells, etc. HDL's job is to take the fats, the lipids, the cholesterol, and move it from the tissues back to the liver. Now, this is a simplification of the process. There's much more that goes on, but it's a general idea to understand here. And we'll talk about more why this is important in a second. When we look at LDL and HDL, oftentimes we hear all different types of terms for these. So you have LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, then you have LDL particles, you have HDL particles, and then now we have this conversation about ApoB and ApoA1. So in order to understand these different terms, LDL-C, HDL-C, ApoB, ApoA1, etc., I want to use an analogy here, and it's going to be an analogy of an Amazon truck or a delivery truck. And so what we have here is we have a delivery truck and there's multiple parts, and each one of these components are describing a different part. So we're talking about LDL cholesterol or HDL cholesterol. This is actually the packages inside the truck. It's the fats inside this truck. The whole truck is going to be the particles. So the LDL particle is the individual truck that's being moved around from the liver to the tissues. And then the HDL particle is the truck that's coming back from the tissues to the liver. Then again, the cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, the packages inside the fats inside each of those trucks. Now, the ApoB and the ApoA1 are the drivers of these trucks. So ApoB is the protein or the driver of the LDL truck. And there's also the VLDL and IDL, which is this whole class of lipoproteins that they kind of go together. The VLDL gets converted to IDL that creates LDL. But then the ApoA1 is the driver of the HDL trucks. And there's some other proteins there as well, but for simplification purposes, ApoA1 is driving that HDL truck. So when we are measuring particles in the blood, like HDL-P or LDL-P, we're seeing how many of these individual trucks we have. When we are measuring LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, we're measuring just the total amount of packages that are in the LDL truck, that are in the HDL truck. But we don't really get to see how many individual trucks there are. And we are measuring the ApoB and the ApoA1, we are getting to see the drivers of each truck. So the ApoB lets us know that there's one driver per every truck. For every LDL particle, there's an ApoB protein, lipoprotein. So we get to see how many drivers there are, which gives us an idea of how many trucks are actually present as well. So this is the key piece to understand with these different lipoproteins. And this is very important when we're going to actually talk about the specific tests that you want so we can truly understand what's going on in terms of cardiovascular disease. There's a couple pieces here that I think are important to set the stage before we actually talk about those specific tests. When we're looking at atherosclerosis, there's this 5-step process, and it can be broken down in a series of steps, but I'm going to distill it here in 5 just to kind of keep it relatively simple. So we have this first step where you have damage to the artery, right? The inside of the artery, you get damage in there. The next step is you have the lipids, particularly the LDL particles, or the LDL type particles that move into that damaged area. The next thing is those lipids can become oxidized. They can become damaged themselves when they move into the arterial wall, into the intimal layer. And then you have an immune activation that comes in and says, hey, these damaged lipids aren't supposed to be here. And that's where you get the immune cells come and try to eat up those lipids to clear out that space. And then the last piece is over time, as that continues, you get a laying down of proteins. So you get some fibrosis in there. The connective tissue structure, the extracellular matrix, gets deposited in there. And then you start to get deposition of calcium. So you get vascular calcification. So you have damage, you have lipid infiltration, you have oxidation of those lipids. Then you have immune activation and fibrosis. And then eventually you get calcification. These are the stages of atherosclerosis altogether. And so this brings us to 2 really important questions that we have to talk about. And these are the elephants in the cardiovascular disease room, right? This big question is, does cholesterol cause cardiovascular disease? And so when we look at this, there's all this uproar about it does, it doesn't, cholesterol is not important, cholesterol is important. You have these like 2 big camps, right? And what I think is the reason we see these dichotomies is because there's a lack of understanding, I think, of what's actually going on and the overarching context. So when we're looking at lipids or we're looking at cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis in general, you need to have the lipids to develop the plaque formation. The plaque is literally loaded with these lipids, right? So you need the lipids to cause cardiovascular disease. So are lipids directly involved in cardiovascular disease? 100%. There's no way to deny it. They are directly involved. Are they themselves the initiating factors that drives this plaque formation and cardiovascular disease in general? And for me, I don't think it's just lipids. I think it's the context with which the lipids exist. So you have a circumstance where you have a bunch of lipids, you have maybe damage to the arterial wall, you have oxidative stress inside the bloodstream, you have metabolic dysfunction going on at the tissues, at the liver, and these things combined to lead to a circumstance where the lipids are then moving into the vascular wall, right? Because it doesn't really make that much sense that you have this transport protein that just causes damage to the highway, the vessels, the blood vessels, the arteries in which it's being transported. So there has to be more going on in the picture. And so I think it's more this overarching context of what is going on in the blood, what is going on at the arterial wall. Is there damage there? Is it being repaired effectively? What's going on metabolically at the tissues and at the liver? What's coming in from the diet? All of these things become important to let us know, like, is there going to be this deposition? Do we have all these other factors that are driving this deposition? That's where looking at other markers and other things going on in the body become very important, like thyroid function, insulin sensitivity, etc. So I think when you understand it this way, it's like, yes, lipids are involved, but there's this overarching context that we need to understand to see, are those lipids actually going to deposit into the vascular wall and drive this plaque formation? So with that encapsulated, the next piece is, in this circumstance, is elevated cholesterol then even a problem? And I think the answer here is it really depends. So if you have a circumstance where, say, you have metabolic dysfunction, you have insulin resistance, you have high loads of oxidative stress, and then you have a bunch of lipids floating around in your blood. Is that going to be a good thing? I don't think so. I think that's a bad thing, and that's something to be corrected. If you are on a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet and you are using the lipoproteins as a way to transport fats, which is your main fuel source in these trucks from your liver to your tissues, does that by itself drive cardiovascular disease? And I don't think it's very clear that that does alone. So what I think happens is, again, you have to look at the context where you are seeing the lipid stuff going on. And a lot of times, if for people who are not on a really low carbohydrate diet, that have a very high fat intake and are lean and all these other characteristics that fit that lean mass hyperresponder profile, if they are having very bumped up lipids, and depending on how the lipid profile and the other factors are shifted, a lot of times that's coming with metabolic dysfunction. And so it's hard to parse those pieces out, right? It's like, are your lipids high just because you're having this transport? Are they high because the tissues aren't taking them up because of metabolic dysfunction going on to the tissues or at the liver? Or is there an inflammatory signal that's driving up the lipids, or is there metabolic dysfunction? These are things that we want to know. So I think when I'm looking at lipids, when I'm looking at a client's profile, I'm trying to understand a variety of these factors together to understand, is this high cholesterol really a problem? Is this high cholesterol showing me metabolic dysfunction? Or are they just coming from a low carb diet? And then that helps me figure out which strategy is going to be useful here to dial the lipids in effectively. Before we get into the labs and the supplement, there's one more really important caveat that I have to mention here. The supplements that we're going to talk about can be very helpful to lower the lipids and shift the distribution of these lipids, the type of lipids that are present. But the major factors that really have the biggest bang for your buck, that drive the biggest process, is the diet that you're eating, how you're structuring the diet, how you're setting up your lifestyle, how you're adjusting your exercise, your body composition, your stress, and then what's going on with your hormonal balance. If those things are dialed in, or while you're dialing those things in, these supplements can become helpful to try to bring the lipids down, shift their distribution, adjust the oxidative stress present inside the bloodstream and the vasculature, so that you have less lipid deposition going on during this time frame while you fix things. So these are not the fundamental solution. These are an option to use while you are getting things under control. And I'm going to make separate videos, and I have separate videos already, talking about the dietary components, some of the lifestyle components and hormonal components, which we'll link at the end of this video here for you. So with that said, what are the 4 key lab tests to look at to really understand what's going on with your cholesterol metabolism? And this is just focusing on cholesterol metabolism. There's a whole litany of lab tests to understand all the different components. And I'm going to put together a full presentation on the different labs I'm looking at all together. But just for the lipid standpoint here, the first thing you need to do is you need to get a NMR lipid panel. And the NMR lipid panel is going to give us a breakdown of the different types of lipid particles that we have in the blood. The next one that we want to get is going to be an ApoB as well as an ApoA1. And these are going to tell us, again, the drivers of those delivery trucks. So we're seeing what type of trucks are present in the blood and how many of them are with the NMR lipid panel. And then with ApoB and ApoA1, we're seeing what's going on with the drivers. And then the last one that we really want to look at is lipoprotein little a. Lipoprotein little a is going to give us an idea of our genetic risk for cardiovascular disease. And we'll talk about this because LP little a is a very special lipid in our blood. Now, in specific, I want to break these down further. When we are looking at LDL-P, which is going to be on your NMR, and ApoB, we are trying to see how many of the atherogenic particles, the lipoproteins, are present, right? So we're trying to see, do we have a lot of these atherogenic particles floating around? And when we look at this, it's going to give us an idea of risk. And we also have to consider the context, right? And the context is a bigger picture with a bunch of other factors. But the first thing is just how many are there. And we also will consider the context. When we're looking at LDL-P, I like to see less than 1,000 nanomoles per liter on the level. And for ApoB, I like to see less than 80 milligrams per deciliter, especially in somebody who has metabolic dysfunction and who has high risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Minimizing the lipids that are present in this overarching state that's dysfunctional is extremely important. And then ideally you get the state better. And in the meantime, you keep the lipids lower to help with some of the deposition. Now, the next one that we have is going to be small, dense LDL particles. And this you'll find in the NMR. Now, the small, dense LDL particles can give us an idea of what's going on with metabolic function. Usually these are bumped up in states of metabolic dysfunction. And these particles, because of their size and their composition, are much more likely to be modified either oxidatively or via like acylation. So you get at different groups added to them. And then they are more likely to have problems interacting with LDL receptors, so they can stay in the blood a little bit longer, become modified more, and also their size allows them to be deposited into the vasculature quite a bit more easily than some of the other particles. So we want to keep these on the lower end because these have the highest risk of the particles of driving some of the atherosclerosis or plaque formation. Now, the next one is the LP little a or lipoprotein little a. This one's a genetic factor. This lipoprotein is very special. It's basically an LDL particle with a certain protein on it called apolipoprotein A. And apolipoprotein A has a really great ability at binding into damaged areas of the vasculature because of the protein structure. It also can inhibit the clotting process or the breakdown of clots inside the blood. So it actually helps with the clotting process. And its job is to help patch up the vasculature when there's been areas of damage or there's a lack of repair. And basically, organisms that can't produce their own vitamin C, which is extremely important in vascular repair, have high levels of LP little a, which is like humans and guinea pigs and some other primates. There's a genetic mutation that occurred around the same time where we lost the ability to produce vitamin C, which repairs our vasculature. But then also we got this LP little a, which is kind of like this backup repair process, kind of spackling over a hole in the wall. So with this, it gives an idea, do you have a high risk for forming plaques in general? And a large portion of the population actually has this genetic risk factor. So it's an important one to look at and to make sure that the vasculature is really tidied up so you don't have a lot of this deposition. When I'm looking at LP little a, I like to see at least less than 75 nanomoles per liter as a level, and ideally less than 25 nanomoles per liter. However, it is a genetic risk factor, so it's going to be high, and we'll talk about some other strategies if you can't effectively lower it to kind of protect yourself, or at least theoretically protect yourself from its effects. The last particles that we're going to look at, or the last values we're going to look at, are HDL-P, which you can find in your NMR lipid panel, and ApoA1. And these are the anti-atherogenic particles. The ApoA1 is the driver of these HDL particles, the HDL particles being this transport truck that takes the lipids from the tissues and brings them back to the liver. And essentially, this is really important because the HDL trucks can actually help regress atherosclerosis. It can help to pull the lipids out of the plaques and clear out the arteries over time. So we want to make sure that we have a decent HDL particle count, an ApoA1 value. And we want to make sure there's different things that we can use that can help to enhance that process of what's called cholesterol efflux, where the immune cells drop off the cholesterol to the HDL trucks so that they can clear out the plaques. When we're looking at HDL-P on an NMR panel, we want to see it greater than 32.8 micromoles per liter. And for ApoA1, ideally, we want to see it between 150 to 200 milligrams per deciliter. The one thing to keep in mind is a higher ApoA1 isn't always better, because in some circumstances, things like alcohol can bump up the ApoA1 levels. And there's, in some research, an inverted U-shaped curve with, there's a U-shaped curve, not inverted, with ApoA1, where basically there's a window where you have the best values between that 150 and 200, and too low is a problem, and too high can be a problem, but it was largely through associations with people who are consuming alcohol. So if you're not drinking, you're not doing some of the things that can bump up ApoA1, these other mechanisms, the higher values tend to be better overall. One other thing that we want to talk about, and this is around the context, is the oxidative state of the body. Is there a high level of oxidative stress? And then also, what is the susceptibility of these particles, particularly the LDL particles, to be oxidized? And the reason this is very important is because normal healthy LDL particles don't tend to drive atherosclerosis by themselves. They have to become oxidized. They have to be changed to drive the atherosclerotic process and induce that immune process, induce that immune activation. So not only do we look at the types of particles present, and we look at the amounts of them, what we want to know is what is their susceptibility to oxidation? And what's going to control this is what are the particles composed of? So what types of fats are present in those particles, as well as what is the environment? What's the antioxidant state of the person in their blood, right? Because if you have a high oxidative state and you have a particle that's very likely to be oxidatively damaged because of the fats that are contained in it, then you can have a high level of oxidized LDL. On the flip side, if you have a high antioxidant status in the blood and the types of fats and the particles are, pretty solid monounsaturated, saturated fats, you're less likely to have this lipid peroxidation process. The types of fats in your diet can actually control how easily the LDL particles actually oxidize. And when we're looking at plaque formation, some of the fats that we see that tend to be associated with the highest amount of plaque are the omega-6 linoleic acid fatty acids, the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid. And so I have a quote here from one of the papers. So what they say here is they say omega-6 linoleic acid is the most abundant fatty acid in low-density lipoprotein particles. Oxidized linoleic acid metabolites are the most abundant oxidized fatty acids in oxidized low-density lipoproteins, which is potentially more atherogenic than unmodified low-density lipoproteins. So if you have a high amount of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids loaded in your LDL particles, then the LDL particles can have an increased risk of being oxidized and produce these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. The next thing they say is a potential mechanism contributing to higher cardiovascular mortality in the linoleic acid intervention group is a diet-induced increased production of the bioactive oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, including 9 and 13 hydroxyperoxy octadecadienoic acid. So these are basically metabolites of oxidized linoleic acid that are strongly associated with a variety of different diseases, including atherosclerosis. They go on to say these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites are enriched in the lipid-laden macrophage foam cells. So those are immune cells that have eaten up the plaques, vascular endothelial cells, these are the cells lining the arteries, and the migrating vascular smooth muscle cells of atherosclerotic lesions. So we see a high amount of these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, these omega-6 polyunsaturated fat metabolites in atherosclerotic lesions. They say oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, particularly the isomers and enantiomers produced by free radical mediated oxidation, have been mechanistically linked to cardiovascular disease pathogenesis. So they're directly linked to the pathogenic process of cardiovascular disease, the development of plaque formation. And they said the mechanisms include the formation of macrophage foam cells. So those are those immune cells that eat up these oxidized lipids, and they become engorged in these lipids, and eventually they can die. Endothelial cell activation. So that's the lining of the arteries. Those cells get activated and damaged by these metabolites. Proliferation and foam cell formation of vascular smooth muscle cells, and the inhibition of lysosomal hydrolysis of low-density lipoprotein cholesterol inserts. So basically, it leads to the formation of the vascular smooth muscle cells, the muscle cells in the artery of being engulfed or gorged with these fats, and then also the inability of the breakdown or the removal of these fats from the plaque. So basically, these types of fats, these oxidized fats, or these oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, when they get put into high amounts into LDL cholesterol, they increase the susceptibility of the LDL cholesterol to oxidation, and that's involved in the process of atherosclerosis. So it's not just the types of particles that you have, and even the amounts of those particles, it's the composition of those particles that become important as well. So we want to look at all of these factors. So this brings me to the supplements. And the reason I went through all of this stuff, I know it was quite a bit, but the reason I went through all of this stuff is because the supplement stack that I have here is set up to target these different components directly. It's meant to make sure that we're bringing the total particle counts down. We're shifting towards a higher amount of the HDL ApoA1 particles. We're helping to lower the atherogenic lipoprotein A particles, and we're helping to minimize the oxidative stress put on those particles altogether. So it's meant to shift things in multiple different ways. It's not just about lowering, it's about changing the distribution, shifting the composition of the particles, and minimizing their ability to be oxidized. So with that, the first supplement that we have here is your very basic vitamin B3 niacin. So this is actually a pretty old supplement used, or at least in the dose was used as medication to treat cardiovascular disease. And basically in some of the research, what you can see is it helps to lower lipoprotein A, little a, by about 20 to 40%. It can so that's that atherogenic lipoprotein. It can decrease the LDL cholesterol by about 14%. It can decrease ApoB, the driver of the LDL cholesterol truck, by about 24 milligrams per deciliter. It can raise the HDL cholesterol by about 16 to 25%. And it can increase the ApoA1 by about 8.23 milligrams per deciliter. So it raises the ApoA1 and increases the HDL truck drivers. It increases the HDL cholesterol in general, and it lowers the ApoB, so the LDL particle truck drivers, as well as lowering the total LDL cholesterol it lowers LP(a), and then it also can lower small dense LDL particles as well. So niacin not only lowers cholesterol, but it shifts the distribution around quite a bit. Now, there's one other thing with niacin that's pretty interesting, is that niacin can also be helpful to improve the metabolic function of the endothelial cells. So it allows the cells lining the arteries to have a better mitochondrial function by supplying vitamin B3, by supplying the precursors for NAD+, which is very important for the mitochondrial bioenergetics of those cells. So it's directly in line with a bioenergetic perspective. And then on top of that, there's some studies showing that niacin can actually halt the progression of a CIMT, a carotid intermedial thickness scan. So it's an ultrasound of the carotid arteries that tells us about plaque formation. And the thicker the artery gets, the more plaque is present. So using niacin in human studies was able to halt that progression. Now, there's a couple problems to keep in mind, though, with niacin. Niacin, especially in the doses that are typically used. So here, the dose that I like to use, about 500 milligrams of niacin, not the extended release, the fast acting, the flushing one, about 2 to 3 times per day. The reason that we don't use the extended release one is because it's more toxic to the liver. And basically how the niacin's metabolized, it can deplete methyl groups in the liver, and that can lead to a liver injury over time. And the extended release version is worse than the rapid release version, the immediate release version. So in this circumstance, to protect the liver, using something like a betaine, a trimethylglycine, in equal amounts with niacin can help to protect the liver by supplying those methyl groups. And there's a paper directly looking at this. The next thing is niacin, by supplying high amounts of NAD, can also, as that NAD breaks down, lead to an increase in uric acid. Now, a way to lower that uric acid is to make sure you have adequate vitamin C on board. And we'll talk about vitamin C in a second because it's going to be important for this altogether. So using about 1 to 2 grams of vitamin C split into 2 doses, as long as you don't have a risk of kidney stones, can be helpful to lower the uric acid that the niacin may bump up, as well as using the betaine to protect the liver from niacin. The last thing is niacin can actually lead to a flushing effect. And the flushing effect is pretty uncomfortable for people. And a way to minimize this is actually use a little bit of aspirin. So in some of the studies, they talk about taking a 325 milligram aspirin before using the niacin. Talk with your doctor, but aspirin is a way to minimize the flushing effect while still also providing a cardiovascular benefit while using niacin. But there is the risk of bleeding and stomach irritation from the aspirin to keep in mind. And the one other one is that niacin can have an impact on insulin sensitivity. So it can decrease it a bit over time. In the short term, it actually improves it because it blocks free fatty acid release, which allows you to use carbohydrates better by not having the free fatty acids floating around in the blood. But long-term high-dose niacin can actually lead to an increase in release of free fatty acids. However, in studies, even in diabetics, about 1 to 1.5 grams per day didn't seem to worsen insulin sensitivity to any significant extent. When you start going to higher dosages, though, over the 1.5 grams per day, you start to see that change in insulin sensitivity. The next one is going to be citrus bioflavonoids. Now, Dr. Pete had talked about the benefits of naringin and naringenin and some of these other citrus bioflavonoids at length when he was talking about the benefits of orange juice. And then even in the bioenergetic community, Georgi Dinkov has created supplements that contain these directly. But in the research, there's a certain type of citrus fruit called citrus bergamot that has a very high concentration of these flavonoids, of these polyphenolic compounds, and are actually able to shift cholesterol metabolism and help lower the cholesterol and actually shift the distribution pretty significantly. So when we're looking at these citrus bioflavonoids, you can see a decrease of total cholesterol by about 30 milligrams per deciliter, with a decrease of the LDL cholesterol by about 30 milligrams per deciliter. You can also see a decrease in those small, dense LDL particles by about 38 to 50%, depending on which LDL particle is being looked at. You can see a decrease in triglycerides, and you can see an increase in HDL cholesterol, about 5 milligrams per deciliter, as well as a decrease in the carotid intermedial thickness, and this is in humans, by about 25%. The product that I personally like to use, there's no affiliation here, but there's a NutriBio product that's called Bergamonte that you can use to help bring the lipids down, and it's basically just these citrus bioflavonoids. So this is another component that you can use as not a statin that can help shift the lipoproteins again while you're getting diet, lifestyle, body composition, all of these things under control. The next supplement that we have here is going to be olive leaf extract. And Dr. Pete had talked about olive oil and some of the polyphenols as being beneficial, but he talked about minimizing the olive oil because it still had about a 12% polyunsaturated fat intake. So you can actually get the benefits of those olive polyphenols without having to incorporate the oil if you're trying to minimize that oil, by using the olive leaf extract, you can get much higher amounts of these oleic polyphenolic compounds. And so when we're looking at the research, the olive leaf extract, there's multiple different studies. They use olive leaf extract, they use high polyphenol olive oil. You can see a decrease in ApoB by about 6%, a decrease in LDL-P by about 12%, a decrease in the small, dense LDL particles by about 15.3%, a decrease in LDL oxidation by about 5%. And what you see is an increase in something called lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme that actually takes the lipoproteins out of blood and into the cells to be utilized for different purposes. So it's not necessarily going in and blocking HMG-CoA reductase like a statin does. It's helping the utilization of these fatty acids. It's also minimizing the oxidation of the LDL particles. So what I tend to like to use is there's a brand called Triquetra. Again, I'm not affiliated with this brand. I don't make any money from this brand, but I use their product. They have a product called Total Olive, and I use one capsule with breakfast because it's also a little bit stimulating. There's a variety of other benefits of the olive polyphenols that are in the olive leaf extract on thyroid function and things like this. But in terms of minimizing LDL oxidation and shifting lipid panel, this is one of the big ones that I use. Those first three supplements can shift the lipid panel significantly in terms of the amount of lipids and their distribution. But the next thing that we want to do is we want to control their oxidation. And also, we want to make sure that they're not depositing into the arterial wall. So these next two supplements aren't really about lowering the lipids. They're more about shifting the oxidation of the lipids and minimizing that lipid peroxidation and also protecting the vascular wall. So the first one is going to be vitamin C. Now, the vitamin C, again, it won't really change the lipids very much, but vitamin C is directly involved in maintaining the arterial wall structure. So it helps to make sure that the arterial wall is rebuilding itself, repairing itself, healing itself from damage. And what you see in humans is we can't make our own vitamin C, so we have to get it from our diet. If we don't get enough, we get something called scurvy. And what we see in scurvy is the vasculature basically degrades over time, and then you basically will bleed. And if it goes through a very extended process, you can bleed to death. And then replacing the vitamin C allows for the rebuilding of the collagen structure or the collagenous structure of the vascular wall. And then basically you stop the bleeding process. In people who have long-term subclinical scurvy, they have an increased development of atherosclerosis. And then in mouse models, which they're testing out now, if you knock out the mouse's ability to make vitamin C and also giving them lipoprotein a, and as I mentioned before, in humans, we lost the ability to produce vitamin C, and around the same time, we developed lipoprotein a, which is very good at repairing the vascular wall. So now they're using mouse models to study this disease process or study how these changes affect the vascular health. And so what they did was they knocked out vitamin C production, added the ability to produce LP in these transgenic mice. So they added these genes to the mice. And essentially what you see is in the mouse that gets adequate vitamin C, they don't develop atherosclerosis to any significant extent. But the mouse that doesn't get vitamin C develops serious atherosclerosis over time because the LP particles are very good at binding into the damaged vascular wall that wasn't able to be healed by the vitamin C. Now, if you just knock out vitamin C in the mice and you don't provide LP you don't genetically allow them to produce this, what winds up happening is they just die from scurvy, like they bleed out and they die early. So the LP the idea is that it helps to protect the vasculature when you aren't able to repair it over time, and it basically forms like a plastering over. But if you have adequate vitamin C, you can help to repair these different areas so that you don't get the atherosclerotic deposition. So with this adequate amount of vitamin C, usually I like to shoot for about 1 gram 2 times per day, which is just easy logistically to take with breakfast and with dinner. It allows you to provide enough to repair the vascular wall, as well as it helps lower that uric acid that we saw increased by niacin. And then the vitamin C can be very helpful to lower lipid peroxidation. So it minimizes the peroxidation of the polyunsaturated fatty acids inside the blood. And there are studies in humans with using a combination of vitamin E and vitamin C to actually minimize lipid peroxidation and also decrease the progression of the plaque inside the carotid artery. So over, I think, a 3 to 6 year time frame, they had men take vitamin C and vitamin E, and they saw the progression of the arterial plaques in the carotid artery had actually decreased with the supplementation, which this brings me to the next supplement and the last supplement here, adequate vitamin E. So vitamin E is the lipid-soluble antioxidant, and it directly helps to minimize the oxidation of fatty acids and the lipoproteins. So adequate vitamin E can decrease that lipid peroxidation, help to protect against the oxidation of the LDL particles. And then on top of that, there's you can see an increase with certain forms of vitamin E of the HDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol function. So we're looking at the tocotrienols. Now, when you're looking at vitamin E, something that's really important to consider is you want to have a balance of alpha tocopherol and gamma tocopherol. Some of the bad outcomes with like using just synthetic alpha tocopherol in the studies have been because they just use synthetic tocopherol. And this is one of the hypotheses. So essentially the regular or even the synthetic tocopherol is not the same as a natural tocopherol. The function's a little bit different. But then on top of that, alpha tocopherol itself's job is to protect against reactive oxygen species, whereas gamma tocopherol's job is to protect against reactive nitrogen species. If you take too much alpha tocopherol, you can start to deplete that gamma tocopherol because they're competing for carriers in the body. And what winds up happening is you protect against reactive oxygen species, but you open yourself up to reactive nitrogen species. So you want to have a balance of alpha tocopherol and gamma tocopherol, and you want to have adequate tocotrienols in the diet, because the tocotrienols, or at least in supplementation, the tocotrienols can be helpful to raise HDL values, the HDL-C values, as well as support the arterial function. So gamma and alpha tocopherol minimize the oxidative stress of the lipoproteins. Also in combination with vitamin C, were shown to help decrease the progression of atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries, and the tocotrienols can help bump up that HDL cholesterol that helps to regress the plaques, as well as protect the arterial function or the endothelial cells lining the arteries. So with this, the product that I like to use is the Life Extension Gamma Tocopherol and Tocotrienols caps. There's one capsule that has both things. Again, I'm not affiliated. There's no monetary incentive here, but this is the product that I use because it has a good balance of both gamma and alpha tocopherol, and it does have tocotrienols present within this one product. So now that you have 4 key tests to gauge your cholesterol metabolism and your heart health, and you have 5 supplements to shift the cholesterol metabolism and help protect your arteries over the long term, the next step is to optimize your body composition so that you're able to effectively metabolize those fats at the tissue and dial in your cholesterol levels from a more fundamental perspective. So with this, I would watch this next video where I'll show you step by step on how you can set up your diet to lose excess body fat without losing your muscle mass or trashing your hormones.